Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to Patrick Henry College. We're so glad that you can make it out today. My name is Les Sillers. I teach journalism here, and we'd like to welcome you to the latest in our series of Newsmaker Interviews with Dr. Marvin Olasky from World Magazine. Our distinguished guest today is Mr. John Dickerson, and I've got a brief bio here. Mr. Dickerson is a native of Washington, D.C., with a distinguished reputation in the news industry. He is currently the chief political correspondent for Slate and political director for CBS News. He also formerly wrote for Time magazine, where he covered the George W. Bush White House. Dickerson has been praised for the probing questions he often uses to stump political figures. In fact, the term Dickersonian was invented after him to describe what the Washington Post called, quote, cleverly worded, seemingly harmless, but incisive questions. Dickerson is also the author of On Her Trail, a book about his late mother, Nancy Dickerson, who was the first female correspondent for CBS News in 1960. Mr. Dickerson frequently appears on PBS's Washington Week, NPR's The Diane Rehm Show, and The Charlie Rose Show. So please welcome Mr. Dickerson with me, please.
So John, Les mentioned that you grew up in Washington, but that's a little different in a way because the Washington you grew up in was not the typical Washington. Tell us about growing up in McLean on 49 acres or whatever.
Yeah. So growing up in the 70s and 80s, Washington was, my mother was the first news correspondent for CBS News, and my father was a businessman in Washington, and he'd been pretty successful. So before they were divorced when I was age 14, so until I was about 14, I lived in a very big house with lots of privilege. And it was a house in which they entertained Republicans, Democrats, independents, and that was the way Washington worked. Nobody had to fundraise on the weekends, so everybody was around. Nobody had to fundraise at the end of the day. So you had a lot of social mixing. And you had a situation then where you would sometimes have conservative Democrats who were more conservative than liberal Republicans and vice versa. So you had a kind of ideological mixing, and it was a more transactional city. It was also, some people would maybe argue, a less representative city because the relationships that were social also were a part of a city clubbiness where you had people who had influence on lawmakers through wealth or through access that got their business done in Washington before the people's business. So, but it was a much more productive city. Now, productive can be good and bad, but there was a lot more that got done because of those relationships. And my mother and father were very much a part of that the kind of social and political and policy all kind of mixed together in a way that it no longer does.
And so your job as a child was to open the door, look each guest in the eye, and say, welcome to Marywood,
which was the name of the house.
How old were you when you were doing that?
I was, I guess, 8 to the last party they had there was for incoming President Reagan, which, so I would have been 13, or not, no, yeah, let's see. Yeah, 13, and that was the last party they had. So I did it, I guess, from when I was 7 or 8 to 13.
How many times did you say, welcome to Marywood?
Probably hundreds, yeah. They had a lot of parties. And I would have to dress probably basically the way I'm dressed now, and they'd trot me out. And that's the last you saw of me. You know, it was not, I wasn't hanging around. I was, sent back up to my bedroom. And
so when you start your gig on Face the Nation, are you going to say welcome to Marywood?
Well, Marywood is now owned by Steve Case, who started America Online, and he's no, I won't be saying that.
People didn't have to fundraise on weekends. Why?
Well, because money, the role of money in politics and television advertisements, it just wasn't. It didn't cost as much to run for president as it does now, or to run for the House and Senate. It costs now, I think the average cost for a Senate race is about $3 million. That's about double what it was 10 years ago. The House is $1 million, double what it was 10 years ago. And also the fundraising and party structure was different in terms of what kind of money the parties could take and the role the parties in the past, the parties played a stronger role in campaigns than they do now. So you also had different, the fundraising laws were different. But basically, it was the campaigns didn't cost what they do now.
Okay. So we sometimes hear about that period as the golden age of civility in Washington.
Yeah.
I suspect that really wasn't the case, but what did...
I think that's, I mean, there was lots of dirty trickery and incivility in the way people, well, I guess if you think of civility in terms of interaction between humans, people are still pretty civil in Washington, face to face.
Okay.
It's just what they do. It's what they do with their behavior and in the public conversation. And there were fewer cameras back then. I mean, there wasn't at that period. There wasn't even C-SPAN. Mm-hmm. So people weren't performing as much for the cameras as they do now, and therefore that probably kept relationships a little better. But there was plenty of incivility between political enemies and rivals behind closed doors.
Now, you did have Barry Goldwater in 1964 running for president, but in general, the parties, I take it, were not as ideological as they are now?
That's right. I mean, and it was, well, it's funny, if you look at, let's look at the Republican Party first. So you have the FDR and the kind of, the control of the Democratic Party and the presidency through 30s and 40s. And then you have this enormous battle in the Republican Party in the 1952 convention between conservatives. Senator Taft from Ohio was considered the far right-wing conservative. And then you had General Eisenhower. But if you look at their positions on things, they weren't that different. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was not, and some people would argue that's the case now, that you have these massive fights, but they're not hugely different. I mean, Taft was called an isolationist, but his argument was basically not a huge open-ended commitment in Europe. I mean, he wasn't for no troops anywhere. So, but that was a really big fight in the Republican Party. And then you had, as you say, Goldwater. So I guess my point is that the ideological fights have been there, and sometimes they've been on genuine ideological grounds, but a lot of times they're on tactical grounds, but they are fought as if core principles are at stake.
Yeah, it may have been that having a common enemy with a lot of nuclear weapons aimed at the United States concentrated the mind wonderfully to avoid some of the little back and forth, backstabbing and so forth.
Yeah, that's true, although, on the other hand, when I was thinking just to Taft and Eisenhower, again, Taft was basically saying we don't want a huge open-ended NATO commitment. Sure, we'll have troops in Europe, but they shouldn't necessarily be on the hook for defending all of Europe, and the Asian threat is maybe more important to worry about with respect to communism. So it was a policy difference about where to put troops to most adequately resist the communist march. But the way it was fought out politically speaking is Claire Booth Luce said about Taft's election, if he won, Stalin would be cheering. I mean, that's, right. That's as if he's saying, oh, communism is just fine, which is not what he was saying at all. So it got pretty heated back then, too.
No one said Taft was a Muslim.
No, they didn't, although, it's funny. I wonder what they back then, the worst thing you could be called in terms of your religious affiliation was Catholic. Yeah. So
right.
that was something they all tried to avoid.
Okay. About a year and a half ago, Mark Leibovich was here, and we talked about his book, Our Town, and so forth. So I just want to run by some of his observations to you, because you've been around for a long, long time. He talks about Washington as the assumption, full with assumptions bred by the same conversation, the same echo chamber. Is Washington for journalists an echo chamber?
I think it is, because nobody wants to seem wrong, because your job is to have information, and you don't want to have bad information. So if there's a collective view, you don't want, or the system does not create incentives for you to take a risk and maybe be wrong, because people will think, well, then he or she is not worth listening to. I think it's faster and easier to believe that if everybody kind of believes the same things. And also, a lot of times, so that's kind of the darkest portrait to paint of this. I think what's also true, though, is that conventional wisdom exists for a reason. There is a set, there's a set of views that if everybody does the same equation, they come up with the same result. And you don't understand what's new and different until it happens. I mean, one definition of history is just a string of surprises. Because, and so by its very definition then, you're going to have lots and lots of surprises where a majority of people, right-thinking people, through the use of reason and analysis of the facts will come to one conclusion, and then, whoops, a black swan event will happen, or history will happen, and something different will change. And that's not because of necessarily an insularity or an echo chamber, but it's just, unpredictable things happen. So there's a continuum on which sometimes it's just everybody's talking to each other and nobody's thinking, pushing their thinking, or everybody's trying to assess and analyze everything and they come to the same conclusion, and it's just history surprises them.
Yeah, so one change from the past, my sense from reading and then also from a long time ago working in the Boston Globe, is that the old-time reporters enjoyed having a front row seat at the circus and looked at it as a circus and very entertaining, not so much ideology-driven. And then starting in the 1970s, there started to be a change. Right. More people coming in with a particular type of ideological training. Is that a...
Yeah, I think, so you have, until newspapers start getting advertisements, you obviously had a partisan press for the huge section of American history, and then newspapers wanted to get advertisements that appealed to both sides, and they kind of started to go down the middle. I think, I feel like the ideological, that the press, there are ideological organs now more so than there were. I don't know if it comes out of the 70s. Obviously the anti-war movement, you had a lot of reporters who came out of that. Sure. You have a lot more reporters now who are not, I'm just trying to think through all the things that have changed the way the ideological, the way the press works now, and where the ideological, because there's the ideological press that's sort of overt about it, and then there's the ideological baggage that we all bring and where that comes from. And why do you place it in the 70s? Does it come out of the kind of counterculture?
Yeah, that's when I was working at the Boston Globe, it was a very interesting division that was starting to arise. Yeah. Most of the old reporters were very often Irish Catholic reporters who just had this sense of, very, very cynical about politicians, but cynical about everyone. Right. And then you had people, and I was one of them at that point, coming in for the most part, from Ivy League institutions, heavily influenced by anti-war activities and seeing everything pretty much through that framework. Yeah. And there was a real divide at that point in the newsroom between these two types.
I think that's right. I think you had they used to say in television news that the cameramen were sort of in favor of the war because they had come from a more middle class, blue collar background, and the fancy pants Ivy League correspondents or writers were a little more anti-war, and that split came from there. Yeah.
And a lot of the old reporters, they hadn't gone to college. They were often copy boys and then cub reporters, and they actually grew up in that and had just a very different sense of things from those who had received an ideological education.
That's right, and that's a problem with it now. To the extent that reporters live different lives than the people they cover, that's not good. And that has to do also with the way the media has changed, and the fact that we have more nationalized stories now. So if every story is nationalized, then it means then the coverage is happening in New York and Washington and L.A., and that's an urban sensibility. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be ideological. It can just be you have no connection with a person who lives their life this way, either in a suburban or exurban way, or who goes to a megachurch, or doesn't mean you're not a person of faith, but you go to a church in a city, which just has different. It just is the kind of experience you have is different than a huge other chunk of America.
Yeah, the famous situation with the Washington Post after there was a huge pro-life march in Washington. And the Post was being attacked. No coverage of it whatsoever. Why'd you do that? And they had a choice. They could either say, well, we just don't agree with that. We're for abortion rights and so forth. Or they could plea bargain and say, we just didn't know about it.
Yeah.
And that's what they did, which is striking and also.
Right, because it's an act of omission because, I mean, and for a whole host of Americans, they would think, well, how could you have missed that? I mean, whatever your view is, it represents.
But they said, there was no one in the newsroom who knew about this or cared about it. So anyway, that's so this is what Mark Leibovich writes at one point, that faith is often used as a political social climbing pose in Washington. He says, and this is talking about Tim Russett's funeral, I was struck by all the invocations of God and a lot of the tributes. Quote, in heaven's green room, people are now watching Tim, end quote. He says, I thought that was ridiculous. Now, is that still the case, or is that going to change as, in many ways, religion becomes less popular?
I wonder. I think, well, there is an unfortunate, and I think this is new, other than obviously John Kennedy's funeral. The celebrity funeral, that doesn't feel right. You've got a sacred event, or what should be a sacred event, and when it starts to share some of the look and feel and smell of the traditional Washington social hierarchical event, there's a clash there that's unpleasant, and that I don't know that if that has anything to do with faith. I think you do find, there are plenty of reporters that I know who are very strong people of faith. So I don't know if that. I guess what I'm trying to get over is the Tim Russert funeral was a sort of supernova event that is so outside of the. But I think what you. So I feel like that part of faith in Washington is just kind of that. That was its own thing. I think the story of faith in Washington that's different is I don't think you have. I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think it's a to the extent people are really. I mean, there are. I don't know what the number is, but there are not a lot of people who are going to church on Sunday, and if they are, it's a very different kind of church experience than people who are living in the rest of the country.
Or the church activity on Sunday morning is watching Face the Nation or Meet the Press.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, so then you just go to 5:00, service on Saturday night. But I don't. I mean, I'm trying to think of. Washington has been, except for during the Kennedy period when it became, there was a kind of, it became cool to be a Catholic in a way. Other than that, religion in Washington has always been kind of, secondary and in the city. There was a period during the early Bush years when he was talking about faith-based institutions and you talking about his faith, in which it was a part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. But as a lived experience, it's always been kind of secondary.
So is it decidedly uncool in Washington if you're an evangelical, especially if you're opposed to abortion, and especially if you have, some concern about same-sex marriage?
Uncool. Well, I guess you probably, to the extent that, I think if you were to uncool it, so for example, if you're raising it at a dinner party, if you said, I think there is not, the system of the city does not encourage people to be, bring that up at dinner in the way they might encourage people to bring up, some great restaurant they went to. Okay. Whereas there are plenty of other places I've been and other dinner parties or dinners or times with people outside of Washington where what happened after the conversation that happened after church is a natural. In other words, it's totally natural to say, I was talking to, Janie after church about this, or the pastor was we went down to the mission and had this conversation. But it's also the political. When I was last or I guess it was 2 trips ago in Des Moines, all of the politics in Des Moines happens on the west side of the city, both because West Des Moines is where a lot of votes are, and it's just also where all the nice venues and everything are. Well, but if you go to Catholic Charities, which has a huge organization in Des Moines, you spend all your time on the east side of town. Yeah. And that's where their family center is, and that's where their shelter is, and that's where the people who need the help are. So it isn't just Washington that's not paying attention to the least among us. And it's striking, having been to Iowa now for almost 25 years, I've never been to an event in East Des Moines. So it's, that's a slightly different point than you were making, but in terms of the way the system, the system pushes the conversation away from faith in a way too.
That's interesting. So never in 25 years over there.
No.
And would that be similar in other cities where they're...
Well, it's a great question. No, not necessarily, and it depends which candidates you're with. So in other words, if you're with Democratic candidates, you're going to be in the city, you're going to be in the inner cities sometimes. And the most systematic tour of inner cities and was that I spent was with Jack Kemp when he was a vice presidential candidate, where he went all throughout some of the hardest hit neighborhoods in the whole country, from Harlem to Watts to South Side of Chicago, trying to talk about these issues. And then basically the Dole campaign said, "That's all very nice, Mr. Vice or Congressman, but you're not getting us any votes there. Please stop and please go to the place where you're more likely to get voters who might vote for Senator Dole." So, but if you think about the nearly 50 million people in poverty in America, how many times do you see an event where candidates are talking about poverty? So, but that's a different issue.
Yeah, and neither Republicans nor Democrats, for the most part, are doing a whole lot of that these days.
Absolutely not. Absolutely. Barack Obama talked about poverty in 2008 because John Edwards had talked about it, and it became a kind of competition in the Democratic primaries. But after that, it was not, front and center in his presidency. And advocates from the left, faith-based advocates from the left, trying to get the White House to talk about those issues, said it was impossible.
Seems to be a lot more reporting on homelessness when Republicans are in the White House compared to Democrats in the White House. And so,
yeah, I think that's probably...
So, Leibovitz said, "I live in Northwest Washington and don't know a lot of evangelical conservatives in my neighborhood. I don't know of any in my newsroom."
I think that's probably true of his newsroom. I think that's probably true to his experience. It's not true to mine, but he's not far from the larger reality. Although he says he doesn't know any, he actually does know them. He may not know they're evangelicals, but right. But that may also say something.
Okay, now right before the Obama second inaugural, you gave him some famous or infamous advice about, in order to make his legacy, he needs to pulverize his opponents,
right,
and so forth. Maybe you can talk about that a little
bit.
But then I really want to ask you what advice you have right now for let's say, conservative evangelical Republicans who are somewhat in shell shock right now at how quickly things are moving over the last couple of years concerning same-sex marriage and so forth.
Right.
So talk about that advice, and then maybe we can transition to current advice.
So the first problem is, this is a piece that got a lot of attention. It was not intended as actual advice, which is the first problem. So, our job is, and this is a written piece, but our job as journalists is to try to make a connection with people, and then through the power of your argument, through reason and fact, convince somebody, or at least have them embrace your argument. So when you fail in that connection, you've failed basically at the most fundamental level. And this is a human need too, right? We all want to be understood. So what I was trying to do was, there's a Yale political scientist, Stephen Skronik, who has this argument about presidencies and political, the tides of history. And he was trying to figure out where Obama fit in the... So one of the arguments was that Jimmy Carter created the conditions for the Reagan resurgence, so that it was not just Reagan, but it was the death of a previous ideology, and that Reagan hastened the decline, and that was part of his greatness, was not just Reagan not only being who he was, but recognizing the times that he was in and riding the waves of that time. And so Skronik has a variety of different templates for what presidencies look like and whether they're transformative or whether they're just caretaker presidencies. So using that was one thing I was looking at. Then the second thing I was looking at is President Obama had said we knew two things about him going into his second term. One is that he's highly ambitious and that he sees himself in the Reagan, FDR mold. This is not a person who thinks of himself and has doubts. So he wanted to achieve greatness.
Move over people on Mount Rushmore and...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, he had at one point thought his route to greatness was to rewire Washington and create a new bipartisanship and all of that. At the beginning of his second term, he, and particularly his advisors, said, we can no longer work with Republicans. It wasn't just complaining. It was, there is no longer anyone on the other end of the telephone line. So if you took those three things, if you took this theory of political science, which is presidents either are active destroyers of the alternative ideology or that ideology falls of its own weight, you take his ambition and you take the fact he wasn't going to work with Republicans. I was trying to set it up as sort of like a math equation. The only result you could imagine coming to, if all those three things are true, was that he would he would take advantage of what he saw as the weaknesses in his opponents and try to destroy them, which is not just to win, but to change, because remember, his ambitions are vast, right? He's not just trying to pass a bill. He's trying to rewire and change American politics in the way he would like to see it for generations. If that's his goal, this is the only way it could go. And I think that argument was, and then by the way, that's where he ended up. If you look at his second inaugural address, he doesn't say, I'd like to do some few small things. He talks about the sweep of history.
So the opposite of Bill Clinton in a way. When he was chastised, he played little ball at that point, but Obama goes bigger.
Yeah, and in that second inaugural address, very much different than the first, where he was reaching out to the other party. He takes a shot in his inaugural address, which is usually you leave this stuff out of it, but he takes basically a shot at Paul Ryan and this idea of makers and takers. So I was trying to kind of say, if you look at this approach to history and you look at his goals and ambitions and the way he thinks about Republicans, this is the only way he's going to go. So anyway, now I didn't do it beautifully enough that everybody's like, wow, that's a great theory. People thought this is the advice you're trying to give.
Although an editor, you did take out a line.
Right. Well, there were some debates about how to, in the editing process, I had a line pretty high up that said, this is not advice, this is, in the piece I'd called it a math problem, a sort of, if you take the following things, this is the only conclusion you can reach. And that was taken out because he felt like it was obvious to the reader. So
which it wasn't.
It clearly wasn't. But it's been a instructive experience because, there are a lot of people who feel like that was possible, that a person after spending 20 plus years in their career trying to play it straight would come out and write a piece that was literally saying this is what the president should do. Which would just behaviorally, that would be like, you've been a vegetarian all your life and suddenly you're grabbing the first animal you can see and just carving it up for dinner.
Right.
Just people don't do that behaviorally, but there are a lot of people who saw that and thought, of course, this is the natural view of people who write and cover politics.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, let's do a math equation in the present. Christian conservatives are yelling a lot and are talking a lot about religious freedom, with Religious Freedom Restoration Act things and so forth, and talking a lot about cake makers and photographers and others, that doesn't seem to be working.
Right.
And question, why do you, a couple of questions, but first, why do you think that's not, is it not working, and if so, why do you think it's not working?
Well, I think because, and this is partially our part, I mean, this is the press, There's one pizza store that was just quietly going about believing what it believed, and, a reporter went and found them, sought them out, didn't force them to say it, but the story was presented in a way and then amplified by the media environment we're in, that became the story. I mean, so I think there's a problem with restraint and context in this debate all the way through. So it becomes about pizzas and cakes. Now, there's a tension here, a larger tension that's a part of our larger cultural debate. But so to your original question, though, when it becomes about pizzas and cakes, you've lost the larger conversation. And if it becomes a civil rights versus pizzas and cakes, you're on the wrong end of that conversation. If it becomes a question of, these are my deeply held views that give me structure to my life, that help me through all of my relationships, and this is the core of who I am, my religious beliefs. And so when these advances are happening in the culture, they're not just small little things. They are destroying, or they are threatening what gets me through the day, what I'm arming my children with to get them through the day. And so if the conversation is about that, which is about where this change in culture and the public debate intersects with people's daily lives and isn't about cakes and pizzas, then I think that becomes something where a person who may be on the other side of you in terms of the same-sex marriage debate could understand why this would be threatening, could understand why you would want to protect and find protection for what you hold sacred. But it rarely gets to that.
Rarely gets to that. And I'm puzzled as to why the difference between the civil rights campaigns of the 50s and 60s and this situation isn't being understood, in that the discrimination back then was discrimination against people. I'm not going to serve you a hamburger. I'm not going to let you stay in my hotel. I'm not going to let you drink from this water fountain. Whereas what's going on today does not seem to be discrimination against people. In other words, the cake bakers are glad to sell cakes, the photographers, but discrimination in regard to being present or seeming to approve of a particular event or activity. So in other words, it's not a question of prejudice against gays. It's a question of prejudice against same-sex marriage. And they're two different things. One's the people, one's the event.
I guess, but the people are, if you look at it from the other side, the people are thinking, I'm being denied a thing that I want, and that's which is marriage and the kind of bond that gives.
Yeah.
So from their point of view, it is against the people, and it's something they desperately want and are being, it's being kept from them. And that's not about cakes and pizzas either. That's about standing up and affirming and committing in front of your God and your friends and whatever other things you may get from the ceremony that they are being walled off from. So that's the way they see it. And for them, it's just as intensely personal, because from that point of view, this is who I am. This is the way many of them believe. This is the way God made me. Sure. And so who are you to deny me the love that I feel for another person? So for them, and that's why I guess my point is, if the public debate were about this personal place that people from opposite sides come from, that in their quiet hours, they're both going to the same place. Maybe they see God differently, but they're both going to him in those moments. And that's a very personal and private and intense experience that people on totally opposite sides of the argument nevertheless share. And so if the conversation comes from those places, then it's at least a little bit more respectful, and you can understand where the other person's coming from, as opposed to what it gets warped in on both sides. But I mean, maybe I'm wanting a conversation that can't exist.
Yeah, but once it becomes a question of rights on the one hand versus personal preferences as it's seen on the other hand, then the rights are going to trump. The rights are going to win. So I'm just wondering if the religious freedom argument is ever going to be a winning argument for Christians, evangelicals who are conservatives. But I'm wondering, at least among reporters, it doesn't seem to be getting any traction. But then if you look at freedom of speech and freedom of the press, for example, if there's a T-shirt maker who doesn't want to print T-shirts with a particular slogan with which he disagrees, and he has a history of not printing T-shirts with slogans of various kinds with which he disagrees. He doesn't see himself as a public utility in that way.
Right.
He sees this as part of his freedom of speech, which includes freedom not to speak in certain ways. Would that have more relatability for journalists than just the claim of religious freedom, which a lot of journalists aren't going to care about because they don't really care about religion? Whereas we do care about freedom of speech and freedom of the press.
Well, I think obviously freedom of speech and press is what they do in there. So
sure.
That might be. So in that way, it's.
Or just the photographer who doesn't want to photograph a gay wedding. Could that be looked upon as, hey, here's a guy who's an artist. He likes to do things that he believes he wants to create aesthetically pleasing photographs. He doesn't think this particular situation is aesthetically pleasing. Let's say the marital kiss. Mm-hmm. And so he doesn't want to do that. I mean, would he get any more traction by just saying, hey, I'm a photographer. I like to photograph certain things. I don't like to photograph other things. Why should I be forced to photograph that which I think is aesthetically unpleasing? Would that get any traction, or would it do any better than a religious freedom argument, which doesn't seem to be working?
I think when you get into... No. I mean,
No.
I don't think that... I think... I mean, I don't know. It's hard, because now I'm trying to, sort of get in the heads of the entire press corps. I mean, I think, going back to your original question, I think explaining this from a personal standpoint is, and maybe your photographer analogy or example gets at that, is the only way I can think about it in order to bring this conversation out of the heated place that it is.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that.
Okay. Maybe there's no alternative to this heated place at present.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably right. I think also once you get it, once politicians get involved, then it starts getting, that takes that causes issues too, because obviously they've got different motivations than just what's the best way to go forward. Some have more than others, but a lot of these issues on both sides have been used to rally and rile up voters in a way that gets people elected. And so when a conversation's happening in that context, everybody is right to be skeptical of motives.
Well, sure, because in 2004, I mean, the Bush campaign was using it as a wedge issue in Ohio.
Sure.
And at that point, the polls were showing basically, 55-45 on the conservative side. And it's interesting, there's been essentially a switch of 1 out of 10. So it's now 55-45 the other way. But that changes the whole context, much as it, strangely in American politics, if you get 55% of the vote in a presidential campaign, it's a landslide.
That's a landslide, yeah. So, I mean, where I think the religious liberty and same-sex marriage debate will be most interesting is in the Republican field.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Bobby Jindal, the governor of Louisiana, I didn't read the article yet, but he's got a piece in the New York Times about, I think it's headline, Standing Up for Marriage. Or so you have a conversation there where, I mean, again, takes this political cast, but, candidates will start to differentiate themselves from each other on the marriage issue and then on a series of related issues, both to speak to voters who care about that issue, but also to send a signal because this is obviously about a larger basket of issues.
Sure.
It's about, is the culture tearing down from all different places the thing that is the basis of my life, and for many people, the basis for the American experience, like this faith and its role. So this doesn't touch just on one issue. It touches on a whole value system and a whole sense of the structure of your life. And so it's a potent, it's a potent political conversation in the Republican side. And there's also just not a political conversation happening on the left in the presidential context.
Right now. We'll go to your questions in a minute. So be ready to raise your hand for a microphone to head your way. But one last question here. Going back to your infamous early 2013 article, where we set up that Jimmy Carter paved the way for Ronald Reagan. Barack Obama, if the parallel works, is paving the way for someone else. Who do you think, any sense of, and I'm not asking for an endorsement or anything like that, obviously, but who do you think that someone could be?
Well, I'm not, so Skowronek has a whole category of also just kind of the muddle, which is nobody paves the way for anything else, because what happens is, what's necessary for this real, and there have only been a handful of presidents who've achieved this, is you have to both have an ascendant, powerful figure like Reagan, and the death of an old ideology. I don't think, right now, both sides think they're right. There is so for example, Bill Clinton comes out of the left and says, I'm in favor of the death penalty. He is more favorable towards corporate interests. He takes positions on marriage and other things that send cultural signals. That is a clear move away from the dead ideology of Carter. I think George W. Bush, there are Republicans who pushed him away, but not because it was a failure of ideology. They think he failed with the ideology. I don't see any Democrats pushing away from Barack Obama, so you need that kind of double. And so what my infamous article was saying is that there were areas that Obama thought he could exploit, and one of them was on gun control. And I can't remember the other one I picked, where he thought that, and we saw him try to do this, if he pushed on those issues, he would sort of be seen as the only reasonable person, in the conversation.
And that never happened.
And that never happened, particularly on gun control.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is one of the fascinating things about politics in our country right now, is you can have an issue where Democrats thought we've got 90% of the country in favor of background checks, but it wasn't the people who care about background checks. Yeah. And so I guess in answer to your question, I don't see, it's kind of this two-part equation you need. I don't see a bunch of voters on the Democratic side who are saying, you know what, our ideology is totally bankrupt and it's failed, so we must abandon it, creating a lot of free-form voters, Reagan Democrat types, who could then go over to a Republican. What we tend to see in general elections is everybody sorts by ideology, and they're going to sort into their normal places. I think there are, particularly also because on the left, you have the likely nominee is likely to be the first woman nominee of a major party, and that's a huge rallying cry for the left, which keeps that coalition in a different way than you would have in every other election. So, so I don't, and also, by the way, you've got a whole on the Republican side, you've got a whole bunch of really qualified, interesting candidates who are all kind of going to be kind of fighting it out at the same level for a while.
Yeah, this looks like a lot more fun than 2012.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be easily the most robust field ever.
Yeah.
I mean, these are even people who've only been one-term senators, which used to be a pejorative in the Republican Party, are dynamic, thoughtful, risk-taking politicians. They're not just, pretty faces in front of TV.
Yeah. Questions?
Hi. What did you think of the Rolling Stone disaster story, and what do you think it says about the political culture in Washington, how that all fell out?
I think, I think it was a disaster. I went to the University of Virginia, so I think that's just important for, it's a piece of context. But when I read the top of it, it didn't sound right. And so there are a lot of basic things that just weren't checked. And so it was a failure of journalistic practice. And I know some journalists who work in that area, which is highly sensitive, where you've got people who've been through or have either been through or claim to have been through traumatic experiences. And I've watched people, Emily Bazelon, who wrote a cover story for the New York Times about a Stanford professor and a relationship that happened between a professor and a student, is the opposite model. It's the going to the person who's been accused of doing something horrible and sitting down, and going through that interviewing everybody, even in the uncomfortable space, because that's just what you're supposed to do, and that wasn't done in this case. So it's almost it's not a cultural thing. It's just doing what you're supposed to do as a reporter thing. But I think obviously in the writing there was a story that was looking for facts to fit into it was almost, there was a feeling at times in it where there was a Mad Lib, and there was just, you were with blanks, and the blanks just had to be filled in. And you see that in varying degrees, but that story really felt like there was a lot of, it was like jury shopping, just looking for some facts to fill into a story that was already written.
Here may be another example of reporters not doing what you're supposed to do as reporters. Because I was always taught, and I suspect you were always taught, look for specific detail. Don't be way up high on the ladder of abstraction, come down to the bottom and so forth. And so it's interesting in the abortion debate and instructive, the recent back and forth between Rand Paul and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, where Rand Paul says, okay, ask Debbie Wasserman Schultz what she thinks about this 7-pound baby who's almost ready to be born. Are you going to kill him?
Yeah.
So he's trying to keep it down at that point, and she just wants to talk up.
Yeah.
We're talking about rights and right to choose and all these vague terms, and then she tries to get Rand Paul to come down. Well, ask Rand Paul what he says about rape and abortion after rape, and so it's shouldn't reporters be pushing both? To come down
absolutely.
the ladder of abstraction.
Absolutely. And, that's, speaking of abstraction versus fact, that was in the infamous article we've talked about, that was a sort of a big theoretical notion idea. Just stay away from those. Right. Just go, do what I do most of the time, and how you and I met, which is, go find the person, talk to them, see what they believe, write that down, tell other people what they believe. It gets you out of trouble about trying to be high-minded. You're exactly right. Questions to candidates on both sides should be as fact-based and evidence-based as possible, and not, we don't have to reach a conclusion because the politicians are telling you something when they avoid a question,
sure,
as much as they are if they actually answer it. And so, yes, and that's the big struggle with presidential campaigns, is to get the candidates away from talking in abstractions, because obviously abstractions are much more appealing to everyone. Yeah. And that's why it drives me crazy when candidates get away with saying, well, that's a hypothetical question. When you become president, all you do all day is answer hypothetical questions, where they say, well, if we arm the Syrian rebels, we might be fighting against those rebels ourselves one day. But if we don't, we've got a moral obligation because Bashar al-Assad is gassing his own people. So, those were hypotheticals they worked through before the facts came to them. So that's all you do all day is answer hypotheticals. And so candidates should have to as well, as a way of finding how they think and what they think. And then we should also allow them to say, I don't know what I would do, but here are the things that are a part of my thinking that would lead me to that question, or lead me to an answer. What we satisfy ourselves with in terms of questions or answers to questions is a mess. We should, because there are some things where there isn't a fact to be, I mean, in the instance you talked about, there are. I mean, what is your opinion if, but then there are other instances where you would just want to see how they amass facts themselves, or how they amass an opinion or a view based on a set of criteria that have been presented before them. And they don't answer that either.
Yeah, it seems to me perfectly appropriate to ask a candidate what he thinks about evolution, for example, because that gets you into his thinking processes. Right. But politicians want to avoid those, reporters want to avoid other. Anyway.
Yeah, I think I felt like when Scott Walker was asked about evolution in London on a trade mission, they were just poking at him, and that's they were just trying to make news.
That's the London press. The American press would never do anything like that.
We would do it too, but I think. Well, it's interesting. There's a theory that I don't know if this makes sense, but so if you were talking earlier about the partisan nature of the press, and I wonder, there is sometimes it can be quite instructive, a conversation that happens between two people of the same ideological viewpoint when they go into areas when a politician doesn't think it's coming from a gotcha kind of adversarial position, where you can learn a whole lot about a politician and what they think. Hugh Hewitt gets a lot of great, useful information out of candidates, conservatives and Republicans who are running for various offices, for two reasons. One, they share a kind of general worldview, and two, they can't say, well, that Hugh Hewitt, he's this crazy lefty, And so in our current conversation, I would love it if candidates would answer every question I ask them. But there are some questions they're only going to answer if it comes from a kind of safer space of somebody who they know is not coming at them from what they perceive to be an ideological position, but just from an informational position.
Yeah. Questions?
You said we also learn a lot from the questions that aren't asked simply because they're not asked, or sometimes because they're not answered. But sometimes because the questions aren't asked or answered, there's these huge gaps in our conversation. A couple of them that come to mind for me perennially, every time I hear a story on immigration, it's a story that has to do, for instance, with should we keep people out? How should we treat people who are in? There's a variety of questions that come up. I never hear the question about how should we call into account leaders of those countries where people are coming from. It just never, ever comes up. Or with global warming, you can imagine all the predictable 10 questions that you always hear, but I never hear anybody say, who decides which is the climate that we feel we want to stick with over the history of the cosmos with this variety of climates we've ever had? Who's going to decide which is the one we want the most? Or I never even hear people saying, how will we as a really intrepid species accommodate this change that may or not be coming? And these are all things that I think it's because they don't fit into comfortably into somebody's political viewpoint. They just sort of don't get asked because they're not comfortable questions for the left or the right. And I'm just wondering, who is it that would ask and answer those questions, and is there a place to go to have those conversations?
Well, I think it's a good question. So I think on the immigration example, there was a little bit of that with the recent influx of kids that were coming to the border last summer. Or was it last summer? Yeah, from Guatemala and Honduras, where the argument was made, even within the administration, that you had to get the policies within the countries and send the message through the leaders of those countries to stop sending, parents to stop getting their kids to come. And there was a debate about whether the president was sending that message forcefully enough, both externally or in public, but also privately through diplomatic channels. And I'm trying to think of that hasn't really come up in this larger migration debate and asylum-seeking conversation that's going on right now with, for example, the boat that just capsized and all the hundreds of people who died. I mean, one of the larger questions So I think what you're talking about is the larger questions that initiate a lot of these things. With immigration, though, so with the migration that's happening in Europe from places like Libya, that should lead you to a larger question about intervention in Libya and why, if Libya is a mess, and that mess is what's sending these people to look for a better life because they'll be killed or because life is so chaotic in Libya. So that should lead us. So the conversation is all about how to deal with the people in these horribly rickety boats who are dying at sea. But the larger conversation is what was wrought by the policy in Libya and whose fault is that, and what does that tell us about intervention, and what does that tell us about maintenance of countries after we've intervened? And I say we, I mean the West. So that's, it seems to me, what kind of questions you're talking about. I think on immigration, the reason it stays away from a higher level set of questions is you've got 12 million undocumented workers in the States. There's a number and a question that has to be dealt with. There are, sort of tactile issues. There's so many tactile issues kind of that get dealt with first because they're kind of right in front of your face. So I think there are a lot of different venues for those questions. I think one of the problems and the reasons it's hard to get to them is sometimes you just have limited time in the way we have our conversations. So, even on Face the Nation, where I spend a lot of my time, a very long interview is only 11 or 12 minutes. And on an issue like immigration, you want to kind of get through some, where are they on the border? Where are they on overstaying visas? What's their view about what to do with the 12 million? Those are fast kind of operational questions. And so you might not be able to get to those higher level questions. Also, politicians like me give answers that are too long. So.
But does ideology sometimes lead to an unwillingness to connect the dots? For example, I think you're exactly right. If you look at the capsizing of the boats and all these hundreds of people killed, you do trace it back to decisions the Obama administration made on intervention in Libya. And if you trace it back, do you come to the conclusion, well, gee, this was not a great idea? And does that in some way hurt the Obama administration and the probable candidate, Hillary Clinton, in a way that journalists don't? Do journalists worry that anything that's going to help conservative Republicans is giving aid and comfort to the enemy?
Yeah, I know. I don't think, it's the biggest weakness that journalists have is that they want a story.
Sure.
So a story of chaos and what Hillary Clinton has to answer for and explain with Libya, I think you'll see that covered quite extensively. I think the ideology doesn't trump, for most reporters, doesn't trump story. Now, it does story selection, that kind of thing.
Okay, or let me ask for a prediction here. Will there, because it is a story, and you're right, journalists, we want a story, will there be some coverage of that now? But when you actually get to the election itself, the candidates are chosen, there is a liberal candidate against a conservative candidate, then is the heat on to not do something that's going to potentially capsize the liberal candidate?
I don't know. I think the heat that's on the mainstream media is for whatever the sort of hottest story is. So for the moment, it's the Clinton fundraising. If you look at the feeding frenzy that's going on right now about the connections between money that was given to the Clinton Global Initiative and Hillary Clinton, it'd be hard to argue that the liberals who want her to be president are running the show.
Right.
So I think, and the Clinton campaign certainly wouldn't feel that way. I think so. But your point again is there's a choice. So there's a candidate on the right, and I think I don't know.
Because right now there's hope maybe that Elizabeth Warren will jump in.
I don't think there's a lot of I think the liberal influence in mainstream media is more either subtle or some people would say insidious, or there aren't people with Elizabeth Warren posters on their walls.
Right.
I think other than I think the reason, the number of people in the press who want an Elizabeth Warren race because it would be actual competition and a story to cover and a battle of ideas far outweighs by like a huge number than the number of people who want her because she's going to, whatever she believes. I mean, by vast numbers. What ends up happening, I mean, political reporters in particular, I mean, they're not, their sin and fault in life may be that they have, not that they're cynical, but that they have no ideology. They don't believe anything. I mean, in other words, I was talking to somebody recently who said, the problem, they said their wife keeps saying to them, is that they just don't believe in anything, and that can be its own frightening, way to view the world.
So let me just ask a question, and maybe this in conclusion. What do you believe in?
What do I believe in? I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe in my family. I believe in fairness and generosity and humility and the power of pride to make us say and do stupid things. I believe in trying to help people who don't have all the incredible number of advantages I have, and I also believe in trying to take risks. I believe in the power of failure to teach you things. I think people should restrain themselves a lot more than they do in conversation, so that wherever you are on the spectrum, you recognize the humanity in the other person on the other side. I think that the lack of that restraint is what's destroying our private and public life. I think that there are a lot of people who make money and political careers based on exacerbating that lack of restraint. And I think that that's a long list, but I feel like it's incomplete.
Let me just ask then one other question, because I'm sure this really interests people here. When you say I believe in Jesus Christ, what do you mean by that?
I believe that Jesus Christ existed and that he died for my sins. And I believe that what he said in the Gospels is a model for the way I should try to lead my life, and that I will always fall short of that and therefore need him to redeem me for that falling short.
Okay. Please join me in thanking John Dickerson.